Hey, welcome everybody, and thank you for being here. This is the second hybrid workshop of the Methods in Social Change and Inertia series that I'm organizing to develop methods for a research project on social change in the Middle East and Southeast Asia with Uyheng and other collaborators. So the series is funded by the British Academy, Talent Development Board, with support from the University of Greenwich Institute for Life Force Development Center for Inequality. I won't be talking about my project today. We are going to go through all of these different methods, workshops, learn all we can, and then at the end of the series in February or so next year, I'll also present sort of my intentions and my thoughts on synthesizing all of these methods. So before we begin, as usual for the series, we'll take a moment's silence in solidarity with those continuing to suffer genocide or ecocide across the globe and all the other crises that we're attempting to address with that. Thank you. So today's speaker is Dr. Josh Uyheng, assistant professor at the Department of Psychology at Ateneo Manila University, where he directs the political psychology of democratization lab. He holds a PhD in societal computing from Manila University, where he was a Knight Fellow of the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Security. His research examines social narratives and networks in contexts of political and technological change, especially in the global south. He's also interested in critical, translational, and mixed methods approaches to computational social science. Thank you so much, Josh, for volunteering your time and coming all the way here to show us what you do. The workshop today is divided into 2 days. Today, Josh will present the critical framework, conceptual framework for computational methods that he's proposing as grounding for tomorrow's hands-on training. Online attendees, you can type questions in the Q&A or in the chat throughout the session. And if you'd like, we also have a question and answer period where you can raise your hand and I can put you on the screen. If you're online as well, we have automated captioning in multiple languages if you're more comfortable with a language other than English. Just turn on the captions and change the language setting at the top right of the captions bar to your preferred language if it's available. The session will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube and our archive, and I'll provide the links at the end. So the floor is yours, George. Thank you.
Am I okay? Okay. All right, so good morning, everyone in the room and virtually. Thanks, Fouad, for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. So as was mentioned, my name is Joshua Uyheng. I actually don't know where I'm supposed to look. This is whichever. And I'm here to talk a little bit about integrating critical and computational analysis to understand collective social construction. I think this is a really interesting sort of sequencing to the workshops because a few days ago we had Simon Angus talking to us a little bit about bringing computational methods into the social sciences, right, into psychological research in particular. And I think one of the ways I've been thinking about this presentation is it might be operating on a sort of reverse trajectory where we bring in ideas from critical approaches to social and political psychology to rethink how we can use and design computational methods for research. So yeah, a little bit about myself. I am at the Ateneo de Manila University, which is in the Philippines, and my interests really do have to do with understanding how we make sense of the world, especially from the global south. And one of the big aspects of that is that we don't make sense of it as isolated individuals, right? But rather as collectives. We think of the world in terms of the groups that we're a part of, the communities which we're a part of, and this tends to kind of run counter to what might be seen as like the mainstream perspective in psychology. And it's really from that sort of starting point that within our research group, and I work a lot with Tina Montiel, who is here virtually. Thanks for the support. It's really because of that perspective that we sought to try to see what computational methods could do, right? So it wasn't that we were looking at all this new technology and saying, this is really cool, let's use this in our research, but more that this is a real theoretical impetus for us to kind of rethink how we do social scientific research, and maybe the methods can play a part in that. But it's not the method for its own sake, right? It's really starting from that perspective. And so I wanted to dedicate this first couple of hours for today to really discuss those conceptual foundations, even though this is a methods workshop event, because I think the approach that we also take is that we prioritize the notion of methodology more than just methods, right? So the idea that methodology is a way of thinking about the specific tools and models that you're putting together, the way you're thinking about your research question and bridging from that question, that state of not really knowing something, to engage the world and then figure out what can we know, right? Given the sorts of methods that we're putting together, the way we're thinking about those methods and what those methods can do. So that's what today is for. The particular sort of anchoring idea that I wanted to use for thinking about the conceptual foundations is collective social construction. And it's intentional that it's sort of a general term, because I think there are quite a few traditions in the critical side of psychology that look at question of meaning, and it's not always just one thing, right? It's not just all discourse, it's not just all social representation, but perhaps the notion of social construction as a collective thing would be able to sort of speak to all of those different ways of thinking. And then I want to kind of go over what critical and computational analyses are and what it would mean to integrate those two in engaging questions of collective social construction. So this is really intended for what I think is really an interdisciplinary audience. I think for some of you here, social construction is like a very basic idea, whereas for others, the notion of a computational model would be super, super basic. But because we're trying to bridge the two, maybe the other side is not we're not too fluent yet, right? Both the languages, to use Simon's bilingualism metaphor from a few days ago. And then tomorrow we'll be looking into specific hands-on practice with some of the methods. You're not intended to be an expert by the end of tomorrow, but hopefully my what I'm thinking of as a realistic goal is that whatever psychological barriers exist, that, I would never code, I would never use a computational method, or when you're getting into your career, there's a little time to learn methods. I hope that can be lowered a little bit, and you can feel that, okay, I'm pressing a couple of buttons, things are happening. Maybe I can actually use these methods for my own work, right? And then the deepening I can't pretend that the deepening will happen in the span of a few hours tomorrow, but I think just opening that door is really the goal. So for today, as I mentioned here, the conceptual questions that I think I want to organize this session around. Please feel free to just interrupt at any time. I really don't mind. And given the somewhat small space that we have here physically, and I think also virtually, it'd be really nice for this also to develop as a conversation. Right, you can think of it as a podcast if you like, but you're very welcome to just chime in at any point. Okay, so let's start with that first section on collective social construction, and then I think this is where it gets I'm going to start at a somewhat basic point. For some it's basic, and for some this is a totally alien thing. Like you saw the word computational in the title, and then you're seeing the slide, what? So I guess let's start with the question of what social construction is. There are many ways to think about this. I think in popular talk, people will say, "Oh, that's just a social construct," meaning it's not real, right? But in fact, that's not what this means. At least to those of us who do study social construction. When we think of something as having been socially constructed, we think about that in terms of it having meaning, right? And that the sense of meaning can vary depending on the sort of tradition that you're following, the specific things that you want to emphasize, right? For some, the meaning of a thing is its sense, like how do you make sense of a thing? What is the significance of a thing in your life? For others, it can be how something feels. The meaning of a thing is how it impacts or shapes my day-to-day life, right? Meaning can be something that's different from person to person, but it can also be something that brings people together, right? So meaning has all of these different dimensions, which you can think about as cognitive or affective or social or political. But it's this big sort of area of study as well as a big area of our lives, right? Meaning is everywhere, and meaning is meaningful, so to speak. And the particular perspective of social construction, just to break it down, is the sense that meaning is made, right? So meaning is not something that is just given or essential or something that we can easily, just take for granted, like this table is here, the meaning is there, right? Because meaning is made, it's contingent. And because meaning is contingent, it can be unmade and remade. And to think about meaning as something that is made, or the making of meaning as a sort of, this present progressive verb, means that it's also a process, right? That the construction of meaning is something that unfolds, that happens through a particular set of actions or interactions. And because of that sense of meaning being made, it's therefore something that we would be interested in examining and trying to understand better, right? And then the second component to this being the word social, right? The idea here is that the making of meaning is not something we do in isolation, right? When we make meaning, we do it together. In the classic social psychological formulation, we make meaning with real, implied, and imagined others, right? Even if we're alone in a room and we're just imagining something, that's not something that takes place independent of the world that you're existing in, the relationships that you're a part of, whoever's in the house with you or whoever's in the city with you. That always plays a role in that process of meaning making, of social construction. So it's with real, implied, and imagined others and in social context. Right? Okay. So in psychology in particular, I think this is one of those papers that many of us who start thinking from a constructionist standpoint in psychology, we tend to start here, right? The reason why we started looking at psychological questions from a social constructionist perspective is what is described in this paper as the soil of discontent, right? So the idea of psychology really not being something that we can reduce to the status of a natural science, right? Of course, there are lots of things that we can do in a similar way to how we do things in the natural sciences. But because psychology deals with humans, and humans are not, the same as a table or air, there's something that is also different within the field of psychology. And this became this big movement within the last century or so. And the dimensions of that movement, first one that is outlined in this paper is the ontological question. What do we take as the given world of the social sciences, and is it the same as the natural sciences? The question of epistemology, what can we know about what is in that world, right? Can we know human beings the same way we know the molecular structure of water, right? And finally, what is the mandate of scientific understanding? And I think that increasingly becomes important in today's day and age where technology and science move so quickly. And we wonder whether, questions of ethics are still being even considered within the natural sciences as much as they probably should be. But there are also questions like that in the social sciences, right? So within that state of discontent about the assumed ontology, epistemology, and ethics of psychology, the social constructionist movement really came about to produce this alternative stance, right? So in terms of ontology, the world and humans in that world being contextual and historical. And it's not sufficient to say that there are some that are weird and some that are non-weird, right? This notion of context and history is more than just that single binary. Oh, you're from the East, you're from the West, right? Like it's not just that. The second question of our knowledge being partial and negotiated, right? Psychology being done today is very different from how it would be done in the 1880s. And we sometimes just seem to forget that maybe in 100 years, the way we think about the knowledge that we're producing now is going to be different, right? We're always producing knowledge in a partial and negotiated way, and it's not the same as just your R squared in a regression model, right? So you don't say that your knowledge is partial because your R squared is 0.7. But even that 0.7 that you think you've explained, there's also still a partial and negotiated aspect of that. And finally, the question of ethics. To know the world is a form of social action. So this is not just about that distinction between basic research and applied research. But when you say something is true within psychology, you're not just performing scientific description. You're actually changing the world. You're changing the way people talk about something. You're changing the way institutions function because of the way we talk about something. I think one of the very classic examples to make this point is that notion of IQ, right? Like we think it's a number. It's something that we measure with like an instrument. Surely that's scientific. Surely that's that's a neutral thing. But we also know that the notion of IQ has been used to legitimize racial hierarchies, oppression on the basis of race, right? Things like that. And so this is where a social constructionist standpoint says it's not enough that we try to just, bury these issues under the surface and just consider ourselves like on the same grounds as a natural science, but we have to take these questions seriously in the way that we conduct psychology, in the way that we frame our questions, ask our questions, and attempt to answer them. So there are many frameworks and traditions within the social constructionist standpoint. These are just a few of them. For those here that have some kind of graduate psychology training, you're probably familiar with stuff on the left, maybe a little bit less and less the way as we move on to the right. I think for most psychology programs nowadays that involve some kind of qualitative module, you would already be introduced to that idea of reflexive thematic analysis, right? So more than just psychology isn't just about measuring stuff with scales or running experiments. You can actually actually listen to people's experiences, to the way they talk about something, and reflexive thematic analysis is really this sort of general purpose way of looking at the patterns in the ways people are talking about certain aspect of their lives or their experiences and finding and looking at those patterns through a theoretically informed way. The other things on this slide take more explicit theoretical positions about what is important to look at in qualitative research. So phenomenology, for example, would be interested in so-called structures of experience, or the essence of an experience, or the texture of an experience. So the lived experience, for instance, of being a graduate student here at University of Greenwich, right? If you're taking a social constructionist standpoint, you're not just going to be looking at what are the demographic distributions or the grade distributions, what are the usual career prospects, right? These are things that maybe you can define quantitatively, but in terms of the feeling of being a student here, what are the spaces that you navigate? What are the sensations that you experience when you wake up and you have to go to to those sorts of things? These are the kinds of quote unquote data that a more mainstream approach to psychology would not even consider to be data, right? But it's really essential to that process of making meaning out of your life as whatever, and then, of course, there are these the discourse analytic traditions, the discourse analysis parenthesis small, of course, referring to that tradition of looking at conversations and how within the context of really just a couple of utterances and social interactions, you're already able to perform rather complicated psychological processes, right, of managing stake and accountability, I believe is how the discourse analysts like to talk about it. One of my examples when I explain this to my students back home is I will say, you have to submit your paper by this date or else I will give you deductions in the grade. And I ask them, when I tell you that, what gives me the right to say that? And what makes it feel as if you have to follow me, right? What about the words that I'm using? And then I tell them, what if you said, oh, but I'm the one paying the tuition, so you can't force me to do anything. I'm the one who's paying your salary. And then if I hear that, what about that statement might compel me to, to like think, okay, yeah, you're right. Or what might compel me to think, no, you're wrong. That was really rude and you're going to fail now. Like these sorts of exchanges. Again, these are not things that are amenable to a classic psychological research design. But from this more social constructionist standpoint, you would then think, wow, that's really rich dynamics, right? And in fact, if you're a student who's like, running up to close to a deadline, you would think this is a very important dynamic that needs to be understood. And then finally here, this discourse analysis big, this one refers to how the actual availability of certain repertoires of meaning and language are structured within society. What are the historical processes that make those kinds of repertoires available or unavailable? So maybe using those examples earlier, it would be things like the push towards neoliberalizing education, for example, instead of it being this sort of relational thing, it's a customer service, your teacher's a service deliverer sort of discourse. So these are many different ways of thinking about social construction, right? And what is really interesting to know is that despite that diversity in theoretical emphasis, I think many of us who do this sort of research will know that there are certain commonalities to how those studies are actually conducted, right? So initially, you start by identifying your data sources. Who are the people that you're going to talk to? Whose words are you going to be using? And how are you going to obtain those words? Usually it's a quote unquote small number of people because you can't actually do 1 million interviews, right? Often there's an element where you want it to be quote unquote naturalistic. So for example, you want to hear what people are actually saying in these conversations that you're interested in rather than artificially making those conversations happen. But of course, if there's no way to actually just look over the shoulder of people and listen to them naturalistically talking, things like interviews, focus group discussions are also good ways of eliciting the kinds of meaning-making processes that you're interested in, right? So you think about the people that you're talking to, whose experiences or meanings you're interested in, and you think about sort of texts that emerge from that kind of engagement with those people. And then in terms of analysis, the somewhat common elements also across those diverse traditions, one is that typically the main thing that is happening is some form of close reading, right? Like you have a bunch of interviews and focus group discussions, and a lot of qualitative method sections really read like, within the research team, we did some iterative and independent coding, meaning you took a look at the transcripts and then tried to identify what the common patterns were. Maybe your identification of patterns is informed by a particular theoretical framework. And then you kind of meet together and say, oh, I saw this, I didn't see that. Did you see this more? What do you think this all means? Is this one thing or is this different things, right? And how do you organize those different codes that you produce? And the second element that is pretty common is that there's this sort of acknowledgement that that process is not quote unquote objective, meaning there's no single correct way to do it. And in fact, it's important that subjectivity, meaning the who is doing the analysis, is brought to the surface, right? Because it's one thing, for instance, for somebody within the community that's being studied to be looking at this talk, to be looking at the data and saying, yes, this is what they're actually saying, right? Or this is what they're saying beneath the surface. This is the sort of organizing principle behind what's happening here in this data versus somebody from, totally different group or community, and trying to impose this sort of interpretation that doesn't actually apply, right? And so this is where qualitative methods also differ from your more typical quantitative methods. It actually matters who is doing the analysis. And the question here is not whether, 8 different researchers will produce 8 different results, but more like, how do you manage that subjectivity in order to identify meaning-making processes in a way that is trustworthy, in a way that the participants themselves might say, oh yeah, that's what I was saying, that's really what I meant, or oh yeah, I never thought about it that way, but actually that is what I mean, right? So that's what's meant here by quote unquote valid qualitative research or social constructionist research. And then in terms of what actually comes out in a results section, typically there are 2 elements to that. There's a way that the data quote unquote zooms out, so something like this camera that zooms in and zooms out. So there's an element of it that zooms out, meaning you have a whole bunch of interview data, focus group data, and you say, okay, I'm not actually going to copy paste all the text into my research paper. Instead, I'm going to summarize it into these sets of themes or these sets of discourses or representations. And then alongside that summarization process of identifying these sorts of broad organizing results, you would also then provide exemplars of those themes. So there's also a sense of zooming in, right? So this is where qualitative results sections. It's been said that at least with a quantitative research project, maybe the difficult part lies in collecting the data, right? Having 1,000 data points, maybe specifying the model, running the code. But as soon as you've done all that, you know the result. You know that, okay, P is less than 0.001, you know the estimate, and it's just, you've already predefined what those estimates are going to mean. But with qualitative research, it's like, I now have the data. What do I do with it? In fact, even if you've identified the themes already, it doesn't mean that your results section is as good as written already. Because you're then going to have to identify what are the parts of the interviews that I'm going to bring in? How am I going to explain how those themes are actually reflected in those exemplars? And it's the writing of the results section that is the doing of the analysis, right? So that's what's also distinct about that. So for those of us here, either in the room or on virtually that might not be too familiar with this process, I have here sort of example of a qualitative study of polarization within a populist regime. So there were about 20 participants here that were interviewed, and those interviews were transcribed. It wasn't a totally naturalistic thing, but we did do a semi-structured interview where we essentially had like 2 or 3 main questions, and then the conversation just flowed from there. The analysis proceeded as a quote-unquote standard qualitative research would go, meaning we did some iterative and independent coding, and then we tried to see what are the themes that are there, and some reflexive considerations of the subject positions of the researchers and the researched, right? So because it's a polarization study, we were very clear that, okay, many of the people on this research team kind of are on one side of that. And then the others, maybe if we're not able to get a member of the political outgroup or the other group in the polarized conflict, at least it's someone who was from there before, but may have changed their minds. Or someone who is very familiar with it because they have like family members or some form of connection to that experience, right? And this is how we organized the results. We identified 4 themes of how people were making sense of this populist regime in a polarized setting. So I am, of course, describing the Philippine experience with Rodrigo Duterte's presidency from 2016 to 2022. And it was really interesting because we had 4 themes that kind of had some similarities, which is why we organized them on this sort of 2x2 chart. Some similarities that also kind of produced interesting differences across the other axes. So what do I mean by that? In research on populism, I think this will be somewhat the top left theme will be the one that is probably most familiar to the dominant thinking about populism. But you start moving to the right, and then you see that there are other ways that people support the populist regime that don't actually align with this sense of the common people, or like being against the elites. On the other hand, opposing the populist regime, this probably is more just this sort of standard, oh, that guy is a murderer and a dictator, that is a tyrant, he's oppressive. But then there's also this other side of that doesn't have this sort of same, he is an anomaly kind of assertion, but rather says, actually, it's nothing new, right? So in a qualitative study, you would try to explain what those themes are somewhat conceptually, but ultimately you would also show quotes from those interviews, right? So you would say, okay, in this first theme, for me, these are all necessary to make the country better. Duterte is just being a strict parent to the country, and as any strict parent, he is willing to reform and teach the people, even though he will look bad. For me, no administration is perfect. What matters to me is the outcome and the improvements made at the end of each administration. Although the Duterte administration may have its violent actions, I deem it necessary to reform and discipline the country. So this is what we kind of discussed as a sort of maybe prototypical presentation of what a supporter of the populist president would believe and sound like, right? Like kind of has some sort of parental framing to the relationship with the president, and is saying, okay, it looks bad, it's flouting these democratic norms, but ultimately it's for our own good, right? And so it's justifying this violation of democratic norms for this more like, this is really for the good of the people, which we understand, which you people who believe in institutions might not, right? So that's one way that people support Duterte. But one of the really interesting themes that we were getting out of these interviews was that there are actually some, I guess, intellectualized ways of supporting the populist president. So I think this is so interesting. I think it's the Duterte admins or Dominguez. So Dominguez is the finance minister. So already naming a particular leader of the technocratic part of the government. I must say, because I doubt anyone else knows jack shit about things. Like, who would have thought that a supporter of a populist would be citing, economic theory? Way of signaling to international markets and learned individuals that this time economic management is going to be different. Does this mean that I'm pro all the economic stances of the administration? The answer is not quite. I'm merely remarking that I'm quite impressed intellectually and also a bit sad that this complexity is something not captured by public media outlets. And so we were just like, wow, this is something that kind of goes against the sort of, majority theorizing about populism, right? This is actually saying, yeah, this sort of flouting the norms and whatever is actually something that is 4D chess. That it's saying, okay, now the economic leaders of the world are going to know that we mean business, and this is like Keynes for some reason. So yeah, so it's this more elite coded or like elite aligned rather than anti-elite way of supporting a populist leader. Here, on the other hand, you have the opposition to the populist regime. It goes without saying they don't care about the country, and they just wrote off idiotic nationalistic sentiment. At least the previous president, Ateneo, didn't blatantly encourage murder. Or this other one, Duterte wants to build a government where he can do anything that he wants, including but not limited to killing off people he doesn't like, ignoring the human rights of our citizens for his naive way of doing things, and cussing everyone he doesn't like, not thinking about who he's representing to the world. So this is like the more essential, the more basic way of thinking about polarization, right? Rather than saying, oh, this guy is our parent and he's making the country better, he's doing it for our own good. It's like, no, this is a murderer. This is a dictator. He's killing us. He's violating human rights. He's awful. He's like the worst thing to happen to our country. But then you get this other one for the fourth theme, which doesn't actually see Duterte as an anomaly, but rather more of the same. So while the previous administrations have been more peaceful, they are no better than Duterte's administration. Aquino failed to help typhoon victims. So the previous president, right? Arroyo, Estrada, and Marcos, other presidents, stole from the country. There are flaws and injustices from each administration, and they are gravely worse because they haven't been dealt with. They are continuously forgiven and let go by the masses, which only encourages these officials to abuse their power. The Philippines has been going through a cycle of the rich and powerful abusing the weak. So, I mean, we're thinking about this a little bit more. I think those latter two themes pretty much capture another sort of division, not just for the pro-populist leader, but also within the anti-populist movement. And of course, we were thinking about it in global South terms, but also we realized this is actually a divide that is salient even in like these sort of weird Western settings. I think this sort of disagreement between is the populist, is this authoritarian populist an anomaly or the natural conclusion of failures of liberal democracy? Like this is something that is playing out even in the US, I think also here in the UK, right? But like for those that are more on the center left versus those on the more progressive left, we were seeing, oh, this is another this is another very, very crucial division within the division that we need to better understand. So that's why we organized it this way, because you have here on the top these sorts of pro-populist leader views, and then here at the bottom, these sort of anti-populist views. But then if you separate them out from left to right, you actually start to see these are the ones that see Duterte in terms of him being a person or like a specific, unique, exceptional individual. And these are the ones that see Duterte as a sort of in relation to these broader institutional contexts, right? So if I'm pro-populist, but I think about him in terms of institutions, then I think like this, right? And then, oops, oh, but then if I'm against him, and I think about him as an isolated individual, this is the way I would be against him. And on the other hand here, this is the way I would be against him if I'm thinking in these broader institutional contexts, right? And so from there, this is a sort of somewhat standard way of doing a qualitative research project. I want to shift to this question of what it would mean to now understand social construction as a collective process, right? So some of the qualitative or constructionist research perspectives do explicitly think about these processes as collective, but then others don't emphasize it in the same way, right? But some of the common ways of bringing in that collective perspective into the social constructionist paradigm, the first is to acknowledge that meaning making takes place in communication, right? So it's not just in your mind, right? But you are talking to other people, right? You are talking to people that you work with, people in the home, people in your political system, and it's within the talk that something goes from being an individual thought to something that, okay, we're all understanding this thing the same way. We're all going to orient towards this thing in the same way. We're all going to act in a shared, organized way. This second thing is that meaning making takes place in community, so that we distinguish between communication and community to kind of increasingly add layers of embeddedness. No, so communication is not just between two people, right? But you now know that these two people are also embedded within like the group that they're a part of. Are we part of the same group? That's a different kind of communication from if we're parts of different groups. We're also parts of multiple groups at the same time. Like we might all be psychologists here, but then Nadia is a clinical psychologist, right? Or not yet. Oh yeah, hopefully soon, right? So recognizing that it's not just about the communication per se, but where the communication is taking place, the bigger groups that we're all a part of, and finally meaning making taking place in context, and that again is like an even bigger sort of circle that our communities are also parts of these political and economic and cultural and historical contexts, right? So the things we're saying to each other, it's not just about the two of us we're talking right now, but also the groups that we're a part of and the space and time within which our groups are located and organized. So the implications of those three things, and this is where I promise I'm getting to that point about the computational stuff, is that when we think about communication, when we think about community and context, their effect or it's weird to talk about effects when we're being social constructionists, right? But one of the things that they introduce to that process of meaning making is this notion of constraint, right? Meaning, I can't just go up to you and say whatever, just whatever, right? It's not like the process of meaning making is a totally free, isolated from history vacuum process. Because I'm talking to someone else, because I'm a part of this bigger community, and because I'm here and now in this space and time, there are certain forces that are structuring the things that are possible for me to say and the ways that I can say them, right? And so in different theoretical traditions, you might think about them as consistency in the things that we're going to say, correlations, right? If you're more quantitative about it, like if I'm saying dog, cat makes more sense, things like that. If you're a social representation scholar, you might be familiar with the notion of there being a core to social representations, meaning if you go around, there might be peripheral things which change, but there's also something that stays the same, right? That is consistent. And when we take seriously that assumption that social construction is not a purely individual or vacuum type process, but something that happens in communication, community, and context, you start kind of also reorienting the way that you engage with those processes of meaning making. Of course, fluidity is such an important concept in meaning making, right? It's the way that my hypothetical student would shift the meaning. No, you're not a dictator here in this classroom. You're actually the person. You're actually the person delivering a service to me, the customer. There's a sense of fluidity there, right? But at the same time, over many different interactions between teachers and students, those are going to be the kinds of fluid interactions that will take place, right? There's probably they're not going to invoke storylines related to, I don't know, like the circus or maybe religion, I'm not sure. But eventually you're going to start to see some regularity in the sort of fluid processes that take place. So you can have fluidity within a sort of broader system that is somewhat exhibiting regularities. Second, from agency to structure. So again, agency is a very important concept in social constructionism. It's that sense that we are not determined by what's going on in the environment. We always have some ability to sort of resist. We have some ability to negotiate and to shift certain meanings. But at the same time, it was very hard for me to get here to the UK, right? I didn't have total agency in managing that visa application process. I still had to come here on the first day, things like that. So meaning there are still forces that impinge upon agency. They don't eliminate it, right? But they're also structuring, they're also enabling and constraining certain aspects of your agency. And then finally, from interpersonal to collective reflexivity, when we think about collective social constructions, this is really the point I want to make here is that it's not just about your individual relationship to the qualitative data or to a person's experience, but you also have to think about it in terms of these sorts of broader systems and structures. Okay, and the big sort of, I guess, review that I want to explain here is that actually, when we think about these four things, what are the reasons why these are the four things that are going to come out in our sort of results? First is that maybe supporters and critics talk among and between each other. Maybe they have some certain shared sources of information and sometimes entertainment. And these are the sorts of things that make it okay. There are going to always be individual variations in the way that we talk about our populist leader, but there are also going to be these sorts of shared patterns. And maybe that's because we talk amongst each other and between groups. These groups are also not, just these sort of unformed masses, right? But they have organizers, they have leaders and followers. The supporters and critics are linked to particular cities, provinces, and regions, right? Where certain ways of talking and thinking about our populist leader, whether it's in opposition or support, are going to become more or less salient. And finally, all of these core meanings are not just coming out of people's unfettered imaginations. There are certain cultural conditions, for example, which feature particular values and beliefs. So for example, that sort of fatherly framing of Duterte is a very Filipino thing. Like we always use family metaphors when we're, when we talk about our political leaders. One of my friends who teaches the culture and psychology major in our university, I think she will get mad that I'm using this example, but she always asks her students, why do we say Tatay Digong, which is Father Duterte, but nobody really says Daddy Trump. Like it's not the same, right? And so cultural conditions, which are part of the context, are impinging on our values and beliefs. There are also economic conditions of heightened inequality. Maybe these more like college plus educated people are the ones who are citing this economic theory to justify Duterte's actions, and then others are more talking about the experience of his leadership on the ground, and then these sorts of political conditions of patronage networks and legacies of authoritarianism. So this stuff, especially here, is informed by a fairly recent collective memory of being under a dictatorship. So these four things are not just they just said it because they wanted to, right? But they're informed by communication, community, and context. And the thing that I wanted to actually, this is what I meant by a reveal, is this was not actually a fully qualitative research, but a mixed methods one, where we took a somewhat more standard quantitative size sample and actually looked at the ways that they responded to specific questions on a scale. And then when you start to see the ways that they diverge, we then selected people from within these quadrants to interview. And we saw, okay, wow, like there's really some organization to the way that they're making sense about the populist leader. So this was the results of the quantitative study. We projected their responses to these structured questions on this latent space. And then we selected people from within those quadrants, and then we talked to them about the regime. And we saw, okay, yeah, this is, oh, sorry, I don't think I aligned them correctly. This one goes here, that one goes there. But essentially you're seeing that the dimensions that are represented in the quantitative analysis actually are playing out in the ways that they actually talk about the populist regime. It was a social representation thing. We were using the concept of cognitive qualification. Okay, so that's an introduction to that question of collective social construction, right? So these social constructions are not individual, but collective, meaning within, these sorts of communication, community context. And so there is some structure in how people are fluidly and agentically making sense of the populist regime. Any questions at this point before we move to the computation side? Online? Okay. Great. Okay. So, all right. So now I guess we're gonna take all of that. So this was this talk so far might have fit in like a course with absolutely no computational material, but this is where we're gonna try to make that bridge. When we talk about computational analysis, these are some of the things that are always like cited, or they were maybe around like the 2015 time when people were saying, oh, everything is big data now. Let's do big data in all fields and all kinds of research. Here are the features of this sort of quote unquote big data that are so exciting, right? So volume, variety, and velocity. There was a time that people would say, because of these three V's, we have a fourth V, which is veracity, meaning we're gonna have the truth, right? The somewhat more pragmatic other V was value. So because we have a huge volume, variety, and velocity of data, we're now going to be able to produce more value from the information that we're gathering. This, of course, isn't limited to research, but this is the way that big data stuff was being marketed also to like corporations and schools and that sort of thing. So volume here refers to, of course, the size of the data, right? Rather than, struggling to get, I don't know, like 100 participants to a survey, you can now get data sets on the order of 100 million, right? Variety, meaning we're not just predetermining the questions that we are going to ask in a scale, but we can actually get all sorts of information from the things people are clicking on, what are they, putting down on their profiles, how are they talking to each other, what do they like, and emotion react to. Even how long they linger on a certain page is already data that is being collected and used, right, to like sell ads and whatnot. And then finally, this question of velocity, which is that this data is not only huge and diverse, but we can get it pretty quickly, right? We can do it we can collect it and analyze it and sort of create these insights in a rapid way. This is not as true anymore 10 years later, with all the social media platforms kind of increasing the costs of data collection and essentially restricting data collection to a few global north institutions that can afford it. But because you have all of those three things, they were sort of these forces that made us rethink what it would mean to do data collection, data representation, and data analysis in social science research. And this is what that sort of looks like here in table form. So in the rows, we have those data actions, and then on the columns, you have the volume, variety, and velocity. So when you're thinking about data collection, you're getting a lot of data. So this is what they call the big data. You're collecting on a wide pool of what you would traditionally think of as columns. So you're not just getting a person's text from an interview, but you're also getting, like when you would collect a tweet, you would get all this information. Like you would get the text, you would get the date and time that it was produced, you would get the name of the person that was producing it, whether or not they're verified, what date their account was created, whom, how many likes and retweets a certain tweet received. So a whole wide pool of columns and features. And in terms of velocity, you wouldn't be just going out, sending out maybe a survey through, what are the usual Qualtrics, right? But you would have all of these big automated pipelines that could give you information like that. Back when I was in graduate school, like maybe a disaster would happen in some country, and then we would just say, okay, what are the words that they're using to talk about it? Let's collect 100,000 tweets. And it was like something you could do in an afternoon, right? Rather than like back then, IRB stuff also wasn't as like caught up yet with the big data quote unquote revolution. And so that's what that looked like for a few years, the data collection stuff. Questions of data representation, I won't be going into too much detail for that here, but there were new questions about what it would mean to efficiently store like 100 million tweets. This is not something you can put on a thumb drive. Also to deal with the diverse format, like it's not just text, but also sometimes images and sometimes it was like network information, right? Who's connected to whom. And how to create these sort of pipelines that in a way that was responsive. Some people were actually really good at monitoring social media feeds and automatically identifying like keywords that would then iterate over to collect more focused data. The part that we're kind of most interested in will be this row, right? How to analyze data with computing on your side. So doing this more large scale analysis, doing this sort of multimodal analysis, meaning you're not just doing an ANOVA, but how do you analyze this text with these images and these connections data together? And real-time analysis, meaning there was suddenly this demand for social scientists to also be able to do this sort of real-time analysis. So again, back in grad school, like there were certain funders that would ask, oh, there's this thing that's happening. Can you give us like a 5-page analysis of what are the major things people are talking about? Who seems to be influential in this conversation? And this is not something that I ever thought would, that they could ever ask a social scientist to do with like a 1-day turnaround time. Like we were now like being put into that sort of logic. But in terms of just really the analysis part of things, there are these two broad modes of analysis, I would say, that I want to focus on and that I want to sort of use as an anchor to connect to the first bunch of stuff I was talking about, which is collective social construction. So this is something that any person starting out with computational modeling is going to learn, that there are two major types of models. One is classification models, which are also sometimes called discriminative or supervised models. And then the other one is clustering models, generative models, and supervised models. Okay, so computational analysis for classification looks like this. You start with this data, and the idea of the model is that it's able to predict the label to that data. So if you were here for the previous sessions, I think this was the kind of model that Simon was focused on. You have a computational model that is able to bridge from data to certain labels. And how that would translate to a psychological setting is, for example, you start with having these psychological inputs that we can use to predict a label. They may be directly measurable psychological features, or maybe words used in an utterance. I think the example that was used a lot in the previous sessions was like using your Facebook likes to then predict your big 5 personality traits, right? So these psychological outputs that you're interested in. So it can be numbers, it can also be like categories. And the idea is that there should be something that mechanistically links between the data and the labels. So if there's reason to believe that the stuff you like on Facebook is related to your personality, then a computational model would be able to suss that out, right? And would be able to then look at new forms of data or new instances of the data and predict these labels in a reliable and accurate fashion, right? And so what a model is essentially is just a mathematical relationship that is learned from the data. So I think Simon was using logistic regression models. So it was just taking in text features. We talked a little bit about the different ways that you're able to represent text. But once you're able to learn a mapping from the data to the label, you are then able to use that mapping in future instances where you see new instances of that data. So that's all the classification really is. It's learning this arrow given a certain set of data and labels. So this relationship usually needs a somewhat large amount of already labeled data. That question of largeness can depend. There isn't really like a fixed number. But the idea is that the more, maybe a good heuristic is the more complicated you think it would be for a human to make that decision, the more data you would probably need for the machine to be able to learn those patterns. If it was something like distinguishing between two completely different languages, like predict if this text is in Polish or Filipino, maybe you don't need actually a lot of data, right? But if it's something like, is this pro-populist or anti-populist, and everybody's talking about the same president, is mentioning the courts and the people, but in different ways, you probably need a larger amount of previously labeled data. And the sort of more computational expertise that's needed is really just being able to write the necessary code to learn those mathematical relationships. So, how do I actually get a model to learn that using this word more means that I'm more likely to fall under this label or that label? How do I get a mathematical model to learn that if I like a certain bunch of maybe sports teams, I have maybe a higher level of openness in my big 5. That's really just a bunch of math and programming, right? And eventually you're able to learn that relationship and apply it to new data. So a point I actually want to make here is that for those of us that are trained in the conventional statistics in psychology or social science research, you can actually think of ordinary least squares regression as one of those types of mathematical relationships, right? It won't be super accurate, but it's like a very rudimentary form of that model. You're learning a relationship between a bunch of predictors and a target y variable. Often your R-squared will be fairly low in a social science setting, but you're also generally learning that relationship from just about maybe 200 people. The relationships that you're learning are limited to linear ones, right? And so the predictive ability of your model will be limited by those constraints. But the idea of these more complicated computational models is they just kind of violate some of those restrictions. So for example, they allow for relationships to be non-linear. They allow for those relationships to sort of consider multiple features at the same time. So what we would call interaction effects, right? If I, yeah, yeah, so that's what this is. It's really a big extension of what we already know in our basic research level stats, like just better models with more data. We can learn and apply these relationships between data and labels. Yes.
Good question. How can we ensure that computational models in psychology and social science not only accurate, but also like theoretically meaningful when we level the as traits with abstract?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So for those online, I think the question is, can we actually get the best of both worlds, right? Because in the social sciences, we use these more simple models, these linear regression models, because one of the big things about that is they're very well understood. And once you see that this is the coefficient estimate for this predictor, there's a fairly fixed interpretation of that, right? Like a unit increase in X will result in certain increases in Y. And this is the sort of uncertainty we're able to associate with that estimate. The more complicated models, let's say like an LLM, for instance, or those sorts of embedding models that were discussed, those start to become nonlinear and much less interpretable. So in a way, we've always thought about those as trade-offs, right? So maybe if you use a stronger, quote unquote, stronger computational model, your predictive ability will increase from 70% to 90%, but you won't actually understand why, right? So that's why we call these models sometimes black boxes, or like the way that we assess the quality of the model is by applying it to data points that we already know the correct labels of, and then just assessing the accuracy. So we just know it's getting the predictions right. We don't necessarily know why. But with the standard social science model, we know why, we know the relationships that we're estimating, but if I tried to use it to predict in like a practical setting, I probably wouldn't use my linear regression model to power Google Translate, right? So that's a sort of trade-off between, the complexities of these models. Yeah. Okay. All right. Here are some of the common applications of these technologies within at least the computational sciences, which actually have been used also in social science research. The one that perhaps is most commonly, used as an example is sentiment analysis. So those of you here or online may have at least heard of this. It's when you're presented with a given text and you're able to you're able to produce this computational model that can say, well, I looked at this text and I think it's positive, negative, or neutral. So that's usually one of the common ways of specifying that model. Another way is a range of continuous values. So I will rate this as -1 for like the most negative, or up to +1 for the most positive. Other sentiment analysis models actually do multidimensional predictions. So maybe valence in terms of positive, negative, but also arousal. Like, is this emotion like making you more active or less active, for instance? So that would be like the distinction between anger and sadness. They're both negative, but one is high arousal, one is low arousal. And then another version is like it does away with these continuous spaces entirely and just thinks in terms of discrete categories. So like the basic emotions theory. So all of these are sentiment analysis models. They all use this sort of basic idea of getting from a certain set of data to a certain set of labels and just learning those mathematical relationships. And yeah, and they're used quite a bit in all sorts of applications. In my own research, I've used these sorts of models for like detecting online hate, right? So if I see a bunch of text, I'm able to pick out which ones like are expressions of hate. And another kind of model that I've tended to use is online stance classification. So I'm able to look at a huge data set, apply that model, and separate them up to like pro Duterte, anti Duterte, that sort of thing, right? So these are the kinds of analyses that are enabled by classification models. So here's one example from my own research where we had this data set of nearly 1 million labeled instances of hate and non-hate. So this is over many, many decades of research. And basically, we were showing that the more identity terms are used, the more likely a certain instance of text was to be hateful. That was a pretty interesting result at the time. We were showing that especially for labeled hate instances that were like sexist, we would see the expected relationships with like gender identities, for races and racial identities, and for anti-religious community hate, we would see a larger number of religious identities. So the argument here was really that, hey, we can predict the hate within a certain text, and also we can sort of understand that some of that is at least partially driven by identity terms. But the big question now, so that chunk of this session was more computational, not very critical collective social construction. So the big question here is, can these techniques be used for the first part of the talk, which is collective social construction? I'm curious what your thoughts are, if you have any. No wrong answers. Could you use this stuff to understand questions of meaning making, collective social construction?
It does give you quite a bit of context.
Yeah.
In a way, that you see community as well.
Yeah, good. Yes. So for instance, if you had a classification model that could look at a bunch of tweets and like separate them out by the different communities that they're a part of, yes, that could definitely help. Good. Yeah. Yes.
Like how can the multidimensional sentiment analysis help social scientists to understand the emotion better in these models?
Sorry, can you say that again?
How can multidimensional sentiment analysis it can help the social scientists to understand the emotion better? How?
So you're not giving me an answer, you're asking me a question. Yeah. No, that's good. That's very good. I don't know. I mean, that could very well be a project. Like how do you link this multidimensional sentiment analysis model with maybe how those emotions are actually lived, or understood by the layperson and not by the emotion scientist. I think that would be a very interesting sort of project, because the people that are making these models don't necessarily think about emotions in that, theoretically heavy lifting way. They're just trying to get high accuracy, So that could very well be a good research question. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Also, when we are collecting opinion on different platforms like Twitter, Facebook, maybe I'm doing I'm thinking to collect opinion or survey in global south. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I collect from different countries, must be the opinion will be in different languages.
Yes.
Okay. And as an individual researcher, how can I handle these different languages opinion or surveys to do the sentiment analysis in social science?
Yeah. So I'll get into a few of those issues that you're bringing up. That's very perceptive, actually. So different approaches that different people use. I think some of them also mentioned by Simon. One would be to just use the best sentiment classifier you have in each of those languages. Second, bring all of them to one anchor language and then use the best model for that language as well. What are the other ways? The third way is to have people who are fluent in those languages to label examples first, and then to train maybe a model to do that classification. So for instance, an LLM or stuff like that. Yeah, so those would be the different ways you might want to do that. So yes, look into whether people in different locations talk differently about the topic to understand how narratives are developed within communities, and look at structural variables. Yes, that's great. If you look into how people talk about the topic over time, you could also see whether the narratives get closer together and how they talk about it. Very good. Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Julia. Yeah, exactly. So yes, so I'm glad that just seeing these concepts, I don't necessarily think you're seeing them for the first time. No, but I'm glad that there are all these really generative ideas for how they could be applied. One of the interesting answers actually to this would be no. Because in a way, the way these things are set up is that they start with pre-labeled data, right? So they actually start with a limited set of possible labels. If you're training a model to just to predict whether a text is positive or negative, that means you're saying that's your view of what an emotion is. You've already fixed that. So if you're someone who thinks that actually emotions should not be tied down to that sort of reductionist, like positivist view, then this whole thing flies in the face of that, epistemological position. And so no is also a very reasonable answer to this question. Right, but I want to bring that up in conjunction with everyone's very nice yeses, right? To show that these things are not they're not ready-made friends, computational methods and critical analysis. In fact, throughout my journey of submitting papers and stuff, I've gotten so many reviews that were just like they're fundamentally incompatible. So that is also perspective. That they just don't work together. I'm just saying that can also happen. Meaning, and I think the invitation of knowing that yes and no are answers that are given by different people is that the reasoning needs to be very clear. The theoretical link between your use of these computational methods and whatever your question is, especially if it's of the critical variety, how do you justify that connection? It's so crucial. Right? It's not something that you can simply assume, nor assume that people will just get, right? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Just on the point of kind of why not, I find it really interesting because it sounds a little bit like if we use, existing pre-labeled data to make sense of new data,
Yeah.
we're using pre-existing collective social constructs to understand new. So we're just using fixed understandings to make new understandings.
Yep.
Which I guess makes sense why a lot of this research doesn't look at meaning making, but relationships between meaning systems. So like large language models and stuff like that, they're not actually interrogating the meaning making process, but assuming that the meaning is there and then looking at the relationships between meaning systems. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. So that is how I think some people would also organize those ideas. Yeah, that definitely especially with an LLM. Right, for example, that's a very that's a set of not just knowledge but also ways of reasoning.
Yeah.
And so yeah, you could also argue that the why not is this sort of classification techniques are just for that part of the question, and then the rest maybe you would use other methods for it. Yep.
It made me think of also similar to a question that you posed earlier, which is I think a lot of us who are trained with theory-heavy understandings of psychology or social science more generally, this kind of, I always struggle with these methods and these papers because when I read them, there's well, we found this and we don't know why that's the case, but we found it. And so that's reality. And so, accept it for what it is. And then those of us who are like, but how or where or, what theory, it doesn't really come into play as much.
Yeah.
Do you think that the kind of bridging of the two can address maybe that limitation a bit?
That's one of my hopes. Yes. I think one of the sort of maybe it's somewhat something of a cognitive limitation is that when we're trained in one, often the institutions that we're trained in are not also training you in the other. And so there's something about that, So one of the maybe ways forward is I think this also echoes the previous speaker, is for these more interdisciplinary and collaborative teams to work together so that it's not just and in a way that is truly holistic and not just you do this part of the paper, I do this side, but mutually working together to design the theory that in a way that aligns with the way these methods actually work and not just in a metaphorical sense, right? But in an actual methodological sense. And then also the other way around, right? So yeah, I think when people are really heavily immersed in these methods and then they try to write these papers, that's just it, right? Like that's what they know and that's what they're writing from. And if they're not working with people who are on that other side or that other level, then that's what's going to happen. Yeah.
Also, just the struggle of publishing mixed methods research, I find is also a massive barrier to this. Because even if you do it as mixed methods and interdisciplinary, then you have to chop it out when you publish it.
Yeah, one of the issues being like page limits. Another being that you can have this truly amazing interdisciplinary team that super gets each other thoughts and writes well together. And then you go to a journal and that's not the structure of the editors. The way that reviewing happens is it's also isolated and individual. So you cannot really expect any single reviewer to understand all sides of the thing that took you an entire team to put together. So yeah, very, very important things that we really have to face in kind of building this body of knowledge. Yeah, very good points. Yes, online more. Okay, good. So the second type of method is known as clustering methods, and there are also like these more basic analogs within what we're taught in psychological statistics training. Maybe not as basic as like a linear regression model, but if you've done any kind of principal component analysis, for instance, factor analysis, then this is somewhat this may somewhat have some ring of familiarity. But just like classification, it's also going from data to a certain label and learning the model that bridges the two. And you are going to start with a similar kind of data. It'll be something that is related to certain psychological features of interest, or it may be language, for instance. But one of the interesting things here is that the labels will not be predefined, right? So they're still assumed to be reliably signaled by inputs. But the idea here is that when you do a sort of clustering technique, you're not saying, okay, I'm going to find which cluster is the positive, which cluster is the negative, right? Instead, you're going to see how are the data points actually organized, and then identify what that cluster might refer to. So the patterns learned from the data will depend somewhat on the clustering model that you're using and what its definition of a cluster is. So for example, a k-means clustering model really just thinks about how data points are positioned in Euclidean space. So if they're closer together in that space, then maybe that's a pattern, right? There are more complicated models, one of which I will be discussing tomorrow, and that's more amenable to like language type analysis. But this is really the distinction between classification, which we talked about just now earlier, and clustering is that classification starts with pre-labeled data, and you want to predict which of those pre-defined labels apply to which data points. Whereas here, you're just looking at the data points, how are they distributed, how are they related to each other, and then seeing how they quote unquote cluster, right? So yeah, sorry. Yeah, so there are no previously labeled data required or imposed, and the existing patterns or tendency in the data used are also the ones that are identifying those latent groups or clusters. Okay. So here are the common applications now. So if you've done any sort of latent class analysis, I think this is how psychological research calls it sometimes. There's also social network analysis. So here's where there's also clustering that's involved with studying social networks. So a social network is really just a way of representing relationships between entities. So like if it's between people, who is talking to whom, right? A clustering algorithm in a social network sense might define a cluster as like a sort of densely connected sub-region of the network where more people are connected to each other and not so much with the people outside. And then, you didn't pre-identify what those clusters will be, but once you see, okay, there's this densely connected region of people, then you would say, okay, who's in there? What might this cluster be referring to? Are they just people that are joining this workshop, for example? Are they people who all are, immigrants from the same country but are students in this university? Things like that. And then finally, topic modeling, which is the clustering algorithm I'll be discussing a little bit by tomorrow, which looks at clusters of texts, right? And so here, a definition of a cluster or a topic in topic modeling parlance is just collections of words that are used often together, right? So that's how it defines that. So it doesn't tell you what the topics are beforehand, but it tells you, like, here are certain structures I'm going to be looking out for in the data. And then we try to identify what those topics are. So here's like a version from one of my research into hateful texts during the pandemic. And when we looked at which hashtags were connected to each other, we were seeing, okay, our definition of a cluster was very bare bones. It was just which hashtags are used together. But then you start to see, oh, they're really like gravitating towards certain regions of this data representation. And then you're starting to see, okay, there's this bunch of hashtags that are just like F, Trump. There's a bunch that are very violent about people. This one is, attacking China, but not quite like to this level. Others talking about biowarfare, anti-communism, that sort of thing. So these were not predefined. We did not know this was what was going to be in the data, but we just had a very bare bones understanding of what a cluster might mean. Yes.
And so is this kind of approach a bit more interpretative because you then have to come up with the labels for them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is often presented as a critique of these methods, but also sometimes it's their strengths, right? So the fact that we have not predefined what the labels would be allows for clustering methods to be much more discovery-based or exploratory. Like, I just have to theoretically fix this notion of a cluster to be, these interconnected hashtags in this context, and then say, okay, if I just use that definition and then mathematically find them, what then am I going to find, right? So here's where I would see, oh yeah, these were all like anti-communist hashtags. These ones were very specifically violent, and all that. Okay, so yes.
Would it be correct to say that you could really inject criticality at either side for either method? So like if you're looking at how you're predefining the labels in a critical way,
Yeah.
then your classifier can be classifying in a fairly, critically oriented way.
Yes.
And if you're, labeling these clusters, if you're doing it in a critical way, then you're sort of representing a critical theory of what this space means.
Yeah.
But if you're not, then it's not.
Very good. Yes. So I was just gonna make exactly the same like connected point, which is you could do the classification stuff very uncritically, and you could do this also very uncritically, right? And yeah, I have a whole bunch of stories of like, for instance, people in my orbit using classification models where they were basically identifying college. So they were not from the Philippines, but they were studying Philippine data. They were identifying college students as terrorists, for example, because they were saying some anti-American things, right? So classification, you can do it critically, you can do it uncritically. Here, you can also do it in both ways. So that is actually one of the major points I want to make throughout this this bunch of workshops. And like, thank you. Yes, exactly.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Yeah, we will get. My goal is to eventually get to that point, and to develop it by starting from where I think most people will be. But that's really the point I want to make. That criticality is not defined by the method, right? But the way that you put the methods together. So that's the distinction between method and methodology that we really want to emphasize. Good. So yeah, so that's the answer to this question. I think for the more standard way of thinking about clustering, there's a much more close alliance with these sorts of questions. I think as Sandra pointed out, right? Because it's not predefined, because it's more interpretative, maybe it sounds a lot more like this sort of stuff, right? So yeah, so good. So this is the summary of that of the last couple of slides. So classification and clustering, this is the major distinctions in terms of function. So one of them identifies data with predefined labels, whereas clustering identifies latent patterns. Data needs for classification, all the data points need to be previously labeled in order to be able to learn the mathematical relationship. For future data points which don't have labels, you will then predict those labels using the learned relationships. In clustering, you just need the data itself, and then the model will be the one to identify those latent patterns. In terms of models, here are some examples. So regression models are actually a very big body of classification models. In clustering, we do much more related to like networks and topics. Some common applications, so sentiment analysis or classification of actors, like where people belong to one community or another. Clustering, there's like grouping people or grouping texts. And then finally, can they be used for social construction? Here are some answers that you might offer. So number one, because it's predefined, maybe it's not really aligned, but it could be, right? There are ways to do that, as I hope we can establish. And then here, some of the possibilities for a no is that just because you've seen the latent groups doesn't mean that you've actually answered anything to do with social construction, right? Like these results are still not a social constructionist analysis, right? Like this cluster is China lies. So I didn't really interpret anything yet in terms of meaning making, but sometimes that's where a computer science paper would stop, right? Like, this is the cluster. And then one point I want to make here is that there's actually no clear conceptual relationship between the data patterns and the sort of themes that the different qualitative traditions are going to take. Like, yes, sorry.
Isn't it already kind of though? You're starting to interpret just by labeling
Yes.
that cluster
Yeah.
as China lies, for example.
Yeah.
There's a different, perhaps, a way of framing that label that might have sort of a different implication or
Absolutely.
emphasis, maybe.
Yeah.
So that's already a sort of theoretical or conceptual choice that you're making.
It is. Yes. So what I wanted to say was it would be a starting point, but it's not where a qualitative researcher would stop, right? Like they would say this, and then they would try to explain why they made that decision, what particular words are connected. So yes, absolutely. But in like a computing paper, this is often the result already, right? So that's where there's a distinction. And I wanted to make a slightly more nuanced point here. This one. There's no clear link between a data pattern as defined by the model and like a theme as would be defined in qualitative research. Like for example, if you're a discourse analyst, you wouldn't necessarily say a cluster is a discourse. Or if you're a social representations person, you wouldn't necessarily say a cluster is a social representation. If you're into thematic analysis, this is not necessarily a theme, right? So some people make that equivalence, but you have to be very careful because it's not something you should take for granted. Right, but a cluster is the same as the major concept in a theoretical tradition.
What's the difference?
So, for example, when you say like a discourse is like an interpretative repertoire, right, which involves like positions that people occupy and a certain force on a social interaction, that is not like the same as a bunch of words that are used together, right? So I hope to show later on that there are some studies we've done where like a topic or like a cluster thematically identified will actually have competing discourses within them because they would use the same words but in very different ways, right? Or maybe a discourse it's more meaningful to like put multiple clusters together. So it can be between or within. So stuff like that.
And in terms of like a theme, how is that different?
Yeah, well, maybe a theme is a little bit easier to connect, but depends also on where the sort of Braun and Clark paper you stop reading, right? So yes, so there isn't an equivalence that you should simply assume. So if you do want to think of them as the same, you would. My position is that you would need to argue why. Let's resume. Just have a second half. All right. So we talked a little bit about collective social construction as the sort of general theoretical area that we would be interested in, and a very, very brief crash course of the different types of computational methods that are available. I just wanted to kind of walk through like some of the logic that, at least in our group, we've been able to sort of develop in some of our projects to kind of justify and orient the integration. So I'll be showing a few examples as well as some of the arguments that we've put forth to sort of make those examples quote unquote work, both conceptually and methodologically. So big question. Again, can computing be critical, or at least can computing be used in service of the critical? I think just the fact that we're having this workshop suggests that maybe we want the answer to be something close to a yes, right? But like I mentioned, there are very good reasons that no would also be a reasonable answer. Like I wouldn't fault you for thinking that. We did write this paper a few years ago that was taking a look at like some of the major sort of orientations that were slowly becoming popular in literature, right? Like there's this big hype around big data. Let's bring it into psychology, and we noticed that if not enough care is taken into applying these methods, you can sort of end up reproducing existing critiques already that exist within psychology as a field in general, right? So two of the broad sort of umbrella critiques that we identified were one, the generic view of individuals, and two, the detached view of the researchers. So in psychology, we already know this has been written up to death already, and still feels like there's always still more to be said. Scientific amplification and normalization of weird subjectivities, and conversely, the scientific exoticization or pathologization of southern subjectivities. In terms of the detached view of the researchers, discounting researcher relationships with human populations. So, like I'm just gonna run this survey in this faraway country. And then also the erasure of wider practices governing psychological knowledge production, such as norms of analysis and scholarly publication. This is also, well discussed in terms of things like helicopter researchers, like, like a well-funded Western researcher goes to an exotic place in Southeast Asia, tells the researchers there what to study, what data to collect, and then becomes the first author. And, like this is something that already just keeps happening within the social sciences. And so the question now is, if we're bringing in these sort of computing techniques, these sort of big data perspectives, are we just going to end up making those problems worse, or just doing more of the same? And there are certain ways of applying these sorts of methods that can reproduce those issues. And we've collectively labeled them as an assimilative view of computing and psychology. So if you are to use these computing techniques and just assimilate them into the ways of doing things as usual, right? So quote unquote uncritically, then you can, So for example, the scientific amplification of weird subjectivities and the pathologization of southern subjectivities can happen if you're treating these sorts of large sets of data points as computationally equivalent, and you decontextualize them from wider societal conditions and just say, hey, look, I have 3 billion data points. Of course, this applies to the world, right? Secondly, the sort of discounting researcher relationships with big data practices. So thinking that just because it's big data, that the quote unquote data speaks for itself, or that it doesn't matter who's the researcher just because it's super, super objective because there's so much data. And the erasure of wider conditions, which nest big data collection, storage, management, analysis, and transmission, right? So things like, equating an LLM with like an objective way of looking at meaning making, right? But this is a very well documented thing that an LLM is not, true. Like, first of all, does a zero-point epistemology exist for looking at questions of meaning? And second, if it did, would an LLM even approach that given the kinds of data we know on the internet and that it's trained on? So these are the sorts of issues that we wanted to be cautious around. Like, it's not enough to just bring in big data and do psychology as usual, or because we think there is this non-negligible risk of reproducing these issues if applied uncritically, right? So those are the three things. So what we wrote about in that paper was we have to be careful around using big data, because even though it seems to be about more people, it could in fact be used to just end up reproducing a more generic view of humanity. And we know that in an unequal world, generic does not mean it's not slanted towards one particular view of humanity. Second, if big data is used in an assimilative way, it just reproduces this sort of unfruitful silence on the relationships of power, which govern knowledge production in psychology. And finally, it can become a reaffirmation and extension of social control. So, like just having more data, you're saying that these understandings of human behavior are more universal. What does that allow you to do, right? In terms of, okay, based on this big data set, this is what we know, and so you have to follow because this is, this is better knowledge than before. And that's a logic that has been used within psychology without big data, right? So we're very cautious around the use of big data as in the sense of political performance that reinforces those existing tendencies. So that being said, again, just by virtue of the fact that we're here all together having this conversation, we do think a yes is possible, but it has to be earned and it has to be worked toward. I really like this paper. This was also very formative for me during the pandemic. This paper that was actually published within a computer science, conference, meaning they, within that field also they've been having this sort of conversation about, are we just making the existing inequities worse by having these, really strong tools? And Abebe gave this sort of framework for thinking about computing in these 4 ways in which it can be like instrumental in social change. So I have a citation here. I really love this paper. So number 1, computing as diagnostic. So being able to use computing to actually measure social problems and diagnose their manifestation. Number 2, computing as formalizer. So the idea that, for the first one, using computing's new like measurement capabilities to actually address social problems and not just to produce this sort of quote unquote universal knowledge, but to orient them towards particular problems. Second is as formalizer. So the fact that computers are actually, for all our talk about artificial intelligence, they really just do what you ask them, right? And so the fact that computing requires formalization, meaning the explicit specification of inputs, it actually forces people to understand something better. And I think Simon's example of how you prompt an LLM was was a very, very good example of this, right? Like, in order to ask an LLM to do a very particular set of tasks of classifying different kinds of populist talk, for instance, you're then required to break it down into like these really clear, theoretical, and precise statements. And I think that is actually one way that can be like a clarifying exercise that's helpful for more of a critical orientation. Third is this I thought was such an interesting point. To clarify the limits of technical interventions and of policies premised on them, so computing as rebuttal. So this was such an interesting point because if you can show how a computing model is going to break down rather than work, you can actually clarify that, this technology is not enough. We need to do more, right? So this I thought was such a good point. And finally, computing as synecdoche, so newly foregrounding long-standing social problems in a new way, just by virtue of how quote unquote novel computing is. It can actually bring new attention to already very long-standing issues. And I think there's this really great paper on what was it called? It was called Gender Shades. So what they were showing was that existing visual technologies get increasingly bad in relation to intersectional categories. So they're very bad at recognizing faces that are not male, so like not your heteronormative male, and they're also very bad at recognizing people that are not white. And then they showed that when you're at the intersection of both of those disadvantaged categories, the error is more than additive, right? So they were just showing, look, this is just another way that these existing hierarchies are being reproduced in terms of these visual technologies, whatever is on your phone, right? Like even on my own smartphone, like I have a bunch of friends that because they're not white, like they get fused as, how there's like on the photos technology, like it tries to identify different people. I have so many friends that are identified as the same person just because they don't seem to fit what is the norm within the visual technology. So so these are the 4 ways that computing can actually be used critically. Yes.
Just you get into like from psychology to computing, right? But that's the opposite. Coming into from computing to psychology, connecting that. Like coming from like technical background, like can I like ties with like when I have data of text from interviews, with posts, different social medias like Reddit. can I convert this text to using NLP model BART, embedding the text, then put this to clustering for labeling and interpretation, then can link with theory of social and social psychology.
Yeah.
That connects. Is it gonna work?
Is it possible? Yes, definitely. So some of the next slides will show a couple of examples, which I hope can provide a sort of like initial example that you can maybe work with for your own research. But yes, it is possible. But I think my sort of more subtle point is that you shouldn't assume that it's easy, right? Or that it's automatically that there's automatically an equivalence. But I think it is possible, and in fact, one of my other sort of normative positions is that those of us who do this sort of critical stuff and are interested in these critical questions, because these technologies are just going to be everywhere, it's really important that we try to have the vocabulary to engage, even if we don't use them ourselves. So it's great that you're also making that connection between your old discipline and your new. Yeah, but I'll show a bunch of examples.
Human interruption is important for critical thinking
Yep.
in this case, but like coming from other way, doing technical thing like using NLP model, BART, like BART is quite large.
Yes,
It's been used for years.
it's a transformer model. Yeah.
Yeah, transformer models, and doing that for text embedding, because BART already pre-trained a lot. It's pre-trained quite a lot, and I've been using that as well. So doing text embedding with that, then we can also use LLM models. So yeah, large language models, and then do the clustering, then connect with theory and link with psychosocial psychology.
I think it's possible. Yes.
And there's also, of course, the other way around, where you start with the theory, and there's also the iterative.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yes. Yeah.
Have theory and method speak to each other the whole way through. There's different ways depending on your purpose.
Yeah, and I think just the general answer is that it's possible. It's possible to do it well, and also very possible to do it not very well and not very critically. So yeah. So I think that's a very good point also, that there isn't necessarily a clear you start with just one and then you get to the other one. They're kind of in dialogue throughout. Great. So yeah, so this is like a big block quote, which is usually a no-no, but what I think this captures like a point that I really want to make, which is that so here I think this was where Fanon departs from Gadamer, is not so much in the appreciation of the value of texts and in the skepticism toward methods that emerges out of the appreciation of phenomenological description, but in the view of tradition. So rather than reading the whole thing, I think I just wanted to say that this was a critique of even qualitative methods, because even though qualitative methods can orient themselves somewhat critically and try to engage with meanings and whatnot, like the kinds of traditions that you draw upon can still be exclusionary. And Fanon in particular was critical of the hermeneutical tradition, which could erase, for example, the Black experience, right? And so in contrast, the other point that is being made here is that it's not really about the methods themselves, nor the understanding of tradition, but the cultivation of a decolonial attitude, which is profoundly epistemological, as well as ethical, political, and aesthetics. So that's kind of the direction that I want to go, which is that quantitative methods are not inherently colonial, nor are qualitative methods inherently liberatory, right? So there has to be a sort of more fundamental reckoning with what is the attitude that you are taking towards your questions, towards research design, and how you're putting these things together. And so let's, going back to that question of collective social construction, if theoretically what we're thinking about is the fact that because it's collective, it's not something that's done by individuals in isolation or in a social vacuum, and therefore meaning making is something that happens agentically but with constraint, then these are some of the things that we have to think about, right? Some explicit commitments for the critical use of computing to understand social construction. So the ontology here is that meanings are collective, right? So that's how we understand what's going on in the world. And our epistemology now is that the interpretations end up being local. So because you're still just a person that's trying to interpret the meanings, the idea here is that even if you're using computational methods, that doesn't make your interpretation quote unquote objective, right? You still have to recognize that there's a form of partiality to it, a form of subjectivity that's embedded into your analysis. And but that being said, from an ethical standpoint, that also doesn't mean that all subject positions are therefore free to play around with all sorts of collective meanings, right? And so one of the things we're very careful about, and which I hope to illustrate through the examples, is that because computing has this sort of totalizing potential, we're very careful about which reflexivities or which identities we're bringing to the forefront when we're engaging in these more subjective portions of the analysis. So that sounds very abstract right now, but I have a few examples which I hope will make those things clearer, right? So I want to use the rest of this time to talk about a couple of studies that we've done, which try to apply these principles. And the first one actually is not explicitly computational in the usual sense of like big data or whatever. It's actually a study in gender, and it's a somewhat smaller scale. But I use it because I think it's a useful illustration of how we can get these sorts of understandings of collective social construction to work with two different sorts of methods. It's a mixed methods, somewhat smaller scale study. And our argument was that, number one, when women are resolving their unplanned pregnancies, they negotiate these discourses of reproductive agency, right? So there's this like stories that are told about what makes women able to make their choices about unplanned pregnancies. But the argument here was, and this is where the collective social construction perspective comes in, is that it's not just about being across cultures, but even within cultures, there are these sorts of structural forces which organize which discourses are more available. And one in particular is class, right? So we think that the experience of having an unplanned pregnancy is very different if you're a relatively wealthy woman versus a woman living in poverty, for example. And so this is, the way that we ask this question, right? So how do middle class and working class Filipino women negotiate discourses of reproductive agency in resolving unplanned pregnancy? So we actually did this as a mixed methods study something like 10 years ago now. And so this was really some of our very initial forays into trying to address that question of meaning making within structure, right? So first we did a quantitative study in order to capture the class structure of meanings, and then a qualitative study to look at how meanings were being negotiated within those structures in making those decisions about pregnancy, right? So we started with a bunch of, so this was very social representations. This was a study that used social representations as its theoretical anchor. And we started with these sorts of everyday statements about women with unplanned pregnancy. So some of them being positive and some of them being stigmatizing. So we did a bunch of pilot studies with a whole bunch of young women, obstetricians, priests, so like places, people where we thought they would have these sort of culturally sanctioned views of women with unplanned pregnancies. And then we went around with cards that had those statements. So we went to like the mall, we went to urban poor community, we went all around with these cards and asked them to organize those cards on this big board. So it was a somewhat embarrassing exercise of getting people to participate in this study, because we were coming from this perspective that social representations reflect our everyday understandings, right? And so putting people in a lab and then say, okay, let's talk about this topic, versus actually going to where the people already were and like playing with this thing that's very like sensory, right? And so once they organized the cards on the board, we basically had a way of quantitizing their positions on the board. And then when we ran a form of factor analysis on it, we were able to see that the cards organized along these two major factors, you could say. So this first one, we labeled it as maternal virtue. So here was like the positive numbers refer to how much this particular factor kind of agrees or disagrees with those individual statements. So here it's like if abortion is killing, there's a very strong factor here under the maternal virtue discourse. Then women are responsible, blah, blah, blah. A baby is a blessing, so this is a very strong factor within this representation. Here, like whether it's a choice is a very negative thing under the maternal virtue representation, but a very strong one here under autonomous choice. Should not be adopting this one very much so. So that's how we were able to look at those card organizations, right? And eventually we were able to plot them on this two-dimensional space where this is the first factor and this is the second factor. So we could actually see which statements were mutually adopted by the two representations. So these are the ones which have positive scores on both. Here are the contested meanings because one is positive and the other one is negative. Here is negative and the other is positive. And here are the ones that are mutually resistant. So in the two representations, actually we were seeing that all these negative things. So all of the participants that we were getting were actually rejecting these statements that if you get pregnant, that means you were poorly raised, or that you were stupid, or that it's shameful, that sort of thing. But they were very clear that actually a baby is a blessing, and actually it can be scary and unsafe. So there were these sorts of clear sources of agreement and disagreement. But here is where things were contested: whether a woman had whether abortion was killing, and whether a woman would be responsible for carrying the term, versus we should be using contraceptives. We should. It's really women's choices, that sort of thing, right? And then you could also see that across the participants, based on their class, it was very clear bifurcation. So if they were working class participants, very strong on the maternal virtue angle, and here you could see it's still very culturally strong even among or middle class participants, but the choice discourse was almost exclusively among them. And then we did interviews with people that had actually gone through that experience. And then we looked at where in their accounts are these representations coming out, right? And so this was really interesting because we were essentially seeing that for women that had gone through either decision, depending on their class position, the same logic would apply, but would push them towards one decision or the other. So here's how some of the accounts went, right? So for working class women who carried the term, stuff like this, right? Why would you kill the child just for your own happiness? It's inside your body. God gave it to you. It's an angel. You're not allowed to. Whatever your sin is, you can't give it to your child. And there are times that you will regret it. It's difficult. But when you see your children, no matter what problems you have, you see them and you're okay, you're happy together. So it's very much that maternal virtue representation, coming out and this is what allows me to carry the term because I'm not going to commit this sin. I'm going to find this virtuous path to motherhood. But in contrast, what we were really, really interested in was the fact that sometimes that same representation could be used to justify an abortion decision, right? So this first one, so I had just had my second child less than a year ago. The helot, so this is like a local indigenous healer, said to me it was still blood, so I decided to do it. That's why I decided to abort. My husband and I decided we just kept having children back then, so it was okay. By the mercy of God, I already have a third child now, but it was just too soon after. And so in this first one, the abortion is actually reframed as a way to protect the family, to actually, go with God's will for the family. And one of the sort of ways of getting around that sort of killing representation was that the indigenous healer said, actually, there's no baby yet. It's just blood. So in the local language, it's like dugo pa lang yan. So it's that's the way that they're able to walk with that representation and still make the decision that would otherwise be stigmatized within that representation, right? Conversely, from the autonomous choice perspective, so this also is the more classic understanding of that. If it's women's choice, then it's okay to actually go through with the abortion, right? So it's and we also saw how class figured into those stories. So We ordered the pill online. It was super simple. We're both on the same page that we didn't want it, and we just knew our way. And okay, we've got to do something about this. The real question was how. So the point I want to make here that maybe isn't super clear in the slide is that actually all forms of abortion are totally illegal in the Philippines. But if you're middle class, it's easy to do. I mean, not easy in the sense that it's like physically easy, but in terms of accessing the things that you need to do it, it is actually accessible if you have the economic resources. It can be expensive, so it can be scary. But when we saw that the medication was sealed, we found a great gynecologist, and we were able to do it right away. Conversely, even if you're carrying the term, it's still about choice. If you're middle class, it's not about God's family or anything. They're just like, even if my boyfriend wanted to abort the child, I was like, no. He kept insisting to abort, but I said, if you're insisting to abort, then we should break up. And it's my family who provides for the child anyway. Or this one, we plan to go to the US and I don't care, this is my life. Can they do anything? They can keep their opinions to themselves. They can spread the rumors, I'm still happy. So what we found was really interesting was that the representations like split by class, but they're not tied to, they're not deterministic of the decisions that the women are making. So this goes back to that sense for us that there are these sorts of class structures to the kinds of meanings that are available, but the stories themselves kind of are able to work within those structured meanings, right? So the Philippines is a very unequal society. If you're within one social class versus another, the kind of cultural things that you're exposed to are completely different, on top of the material things that are available to you. And then the stories that you're able to tell are also different. But they're not deterministic of the decisions that you can make, right? And so social class structures, the availability of the stories and the ability to act upon them, but there's still agency within acting upon this space. So that's like how we started to develop that sort of approach to meaning making that is situated within these collective contexts, right? And what I'm going to talk about now is applying that with this sort of more computational methodology. So in this study, we were looking at collective emotions toward populist political change. So this was at the time that the populist president Duterte was trying to shift the Philippines towards federalism. So political changes like the federalization of a country can produce structural shifts, but more than the cognitive responses, they also evoke collective emotional responses. And so we were trying to look at the collective emotion in response to that populist push for federalization. And here's where actually I hope to show how that sentiment analysis stuff and this more critical orientation towards meaning making can hopefully make sense together. So just like in that previous study, our idea was that, okay, these computational quantitative methods may be used to capture these more coarse-grained categories, and then we can use qualitative methods from here to critically interpret and contextualize the results from the computational side. So what does that look like in particular? First, we had this big-ish data set of social media talk on this push towards federalism. So it didn't actually happen, but there was a very long time that we thought it was going to happen because Duterte was pushing for it. And we brought together this research team of people who were from the political center and from the political peripheries of the country, where federalism was actually being designed to sort of, move the wealth from the center of Manila towards the provinces at the margins. And so we wanted people who might be on different structural positions relative to that political change. And we had them take a look at this initial sample of Facebook comments. So this is somewhat similar to the methods pipeline that Simon talked about, where you would start with, I think his word was domain experts. And in our case, we didn't think about this in terms of expertise. Like there's going to be someone who knows this in a somewhat absolute or reliable way. Instead, because we were thinking about this as an inherently contested political thing, we wanted people who would be structurally located in different ways. So there's no absolute expertise from this perspective, but very different relationships with that contested political object. And so we started there. We measured the reliability across the annotators. And we also did this thing where the texts they were annotating had some repetitions. So we could also measure intra-rater reliability. And so from there, we asked, okay, is this Facebook comment pro or anti-federalism? And is it a positive feeling or a negative feeling? So just a very basic set of two questions. And then what we would do also was that we didn't want this to just be like, okay, here's your assignment, submit it, and then we'll be done, right? We can go. We actually had these really intensive conversations where we would talk about what did you see in the data, what does the annotation look like, can we look for initial examples where we're all disagreeing or agreeing, and so we were making it this very sort of intensive dialogical process. So this process of annotation not as something that you can just outsource to an expert, but becomes a way of enacting that sort of that process of meaning contestation. And then from there, we were able to eventually produce a labeled data set where we could all sort of agree. So once we had that data set, which was the output of a very long sort of politically charged process, we were eventually able to produce a model that we were comfortable with applying to the rest of the data set. Yeah, in terms of classifying the Facebook comments into stance, so pro and anti-federalism, and then sentiment, meaning positive or negative feelings, right? So from there, we then applied it to the rest of the data set. It was several 10,000s, I think, or just around 10,000 Facebook comments at the time. And then, okay, so now we have this data set that is broken up into these two sets of two categories. So if you split them up into these, 2 by 2, so to these 4 intersected categories, we then started to look at, okay, what are the words which pop out the most in these categories that don't show up in the others, right? And so in the pro-federalism with positive feelings, we were seeing, okay, this word yes, this word beautiful changed, there's God again, because everything is about God. Father, so this tatay. For the no to federalism, it's like, well, it's the word no. So dynasties, charter, Marcos, who is the previous dictator, and the constitution. So these again are like the somewhat classic sort of maybe archetypal things you would think about when thinking about people that are against or for this political change. But we also had these 2 other categories which are a little bit strange, right? So there were people that were for federalism but expressing a lot of negative feelings. And what we saw was that it was about corruption, this dilawan, which refers to yellow. So that's the political party that were framed as the elites during Duterte's populist rise to power, the Senate, and what they call Imperial Manila. So thinking about Manila as an imperial entity. And then finally, the no to federalism people were also expressing positive feelings, which used a lot of ha ha ha, love, support, and understand, right? So just on their own, these words may suggest something somewhat intuitive, but they're not completely like telling you what's going on, right, within these quadrants. And so what we did was from there, we computationally identified comments within these quadrants which contained these top words, right? And once we were able to do that, we were able to then sort of connect how those words are being used together in context. So this process of interpreting these words, which are derived quantitatively, by looking at how they're used qualitatively in context, we were then able to arrive at this mapping of the emotions, right? So this one, the yes, the change, the tatay, or the father, the God, we saw this is how they are being used, right, within this quadrant. So those that are pro-federalism and expressing positive feelings, they're saying, yes, this is a beautiful change for the country. God bless and thank you, Tatay Digong or Father Duterte. I'm watching for support and mabuhay or long live this movement, right? Whereas those that were saying no and expressing negative feelings, it was no to federalism, unless we deal with political dynasties. Stop this charter change and attempts to tamper with the constitution, because Duterte is just trying to consolidate power like Marcos or the previous dictator. And then on these sort of off-diagonal quadrants, we were seeing those that were saying yes to federalism and expressing negative feelings. Only the corrupt and the yellows of the Senate oppose federalism because they will lose money and power. The budget should go to Mindanao or the southern provinces instead of Imperial Manila. And then over here, we were seeing, haha, do they even understand the federalism that they're supporting? I love it, right? So these are, I want to kind of take you through the trajectory of things. We started with the classifiers, and then from the classifiers, we were able to put these words, we were able to identify the top words within the data set across those quadrants. And then qualitatively, after coding and interpreting the comments which are actually classified into these categories, we were then putting these words together into these sorts of evocative storylines that sort of summarize what's going on, right? And so in terms of our initial question of collective emotions, we could then interpret what those emotions might be, right? So if it's about God bless and beautiful change, we interpret that as hope and euphoria. Here, this is in terms of fear and skepticism. What we thought was really interesting in these off diagonals was that even if you're supporting something, you can show a lot of negative emotion, and we labeled that as vindictive contempt. And here, if you're against something, you can also show a lot of positive emotion. And here, we labeled this as derisive amusement, right? So people were just laughing at the supporters, which is a very elite position opposition. So here in the paper, we also we did that usual qualitative analysis where we actually took a look at specific texts, which allowed us to produce those synthesized interpretations. So in terms of hope and euphoria, we copied them in exact formatting, so all the caps and are really what they look like. So hello, good morning, watching from Sharjah, UAE. Go, 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 Father Digong for federalism. We love you. Duterte forever. God bless you always. God Almighty always guide you. So this is in response to things about federalism. This is about federalism, and yet it's expressing this hope and euphoria, as we called it in that paper. So this is what the voice of the Filipino people really want. Many citizens' quality of life will rise. This is the road to peace, federalism, so the people will see striving leaders for every place in the Philippines. For those that were supporting federalism and yet expressing negative emotions, we could also see this vindictive contempt play out. So that's why the Senate doesn't want federalism. They will lose their function. They're all useless. They don't want federalism. They're just protecting the oligarchs. Typical weakness, especially those feces-faced yellow. Parliamentary federalism is needed to get rid of the pigs, dogs, and crocodiles, demons in Imperial Manila. Destroy Manila imperialism. It's not only them who are the Philippines. The derisive amusement. This is now on the side of people against federalism, but expressing some, at least according to the classifier, positive emotions. So if you ask them the provisions of federalism, they'll only say one thing: you're a yellow. You're so stupid. Please read what federalism is about. The only thing right about what you said is that there won't be a Senate anymore. You're pitiful. Federal dogs is what you call these blind followers. Worshipping federalism and the new Bible of corruption. #scam. Finally, this is the fear and skepticism one on the bottom right. I hope that when we have a federal form of government, we can clarify the situation, or better yet, prohibit President Duterte. Imagine, for example, that one state has one family sitting in office, and then it'll always just be them. So no way to federalism, definitely not now. It's very obvious that corrupt politicians of this administration are hell-bent on perpetuating themselves in power. So just, I suppose I neglected to explain that this is really one of the big, this was one of the big axes of the debate on the formal, in the formal sense of the political debate, that on the one hand, federalism will make for more economically equitable arrangements within the Philippines. But then those against it were saying, but if we're federalized, then the political dynasties within the provinces are just going to have more power. Right? So it was through that combination of computational methods, right, where we split up the data into these 4 quadrants, which we could not do, right, manually. And then the qualitative methods, which allowed us to interpret what was going on within these quadrants. And I guess the other layer to that was even before doing the computational methods, the training of that model was itself already embedded with the sort of like, at least what we thought was like a critical approach, right? Where it wasn't just one of us dictating what the meaning of something was, but we had people who would benefit or not benefit from the policy kind of really talk seriously about each and every single data point that went into our quote unquote training data set. So no assumption of like a 0-point perfect epistemology or like a perfect labeler or domain expert, but the data itself was the product of very intensive and intentional collective move. Okay, so this is how I hope to close the day. So just revisiting those ideas, right? That collective social construction emerges as a result of communication, community, and context, introducing these sorts of constraints to meaning making. And so when we try to combine computational and critical methods to address those kinds of questions, we think that maybe quantitative methods are well suited to apprehend those constraining forces, right? Because if we're seeing meaning making as already being structured by these sorts of regularities, by structure, maybe numbers are a good way to engage with that, right? Qualitative methods, on the other hand, are very well, I mean, they're designed specifically to engage with that fluid aspect of meaning making. And so that's how we've been able to position these methods in relation to each other. But if we really think that this is how meaning making is collective social construction is taking place, then maybe this is how we can organize those two. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that one is more critical than the other, right? Like, let's be uncritical during the quantity stuff and then the critical during the qualitative stuff. In fact, there are critical principles that you can integrate into both components. And the insight is not limited to just one of those methods, right? It's not the quantitative methods that's producing the insights. It's not the qualitative methods. It's both used in conjunction with each other. So, yeah. So in terms of the ontology, epistemology stuff, this is how we were thinking about it, right? Maybe there's a way to use quantitative methods constructionistly. And maybe we can also use quantities in guiding our qualitative methods. Yeah. So the very final slide that I wanted to close with, and I think this is where right now our research group is still really thinking about where to bring these ideas, especially in a time when LLMs are really exploding and technology is always going to change, right? 5 years ago, we never could have thought about what is capable with GPT and its variations. And so some questions leading into tomorrow, both literally and metaphorically. When we are engaging collective social constructions, whose meanings are we engaging, right? So if we're applying these big data and computing things, are we trying to say that there's a universal meaning that we want to understand? Like, is it the world, right? Or are we trying to engage with the constructions of a particular group? And when we say it's a group, is it a group that is in power or beneath power? Second, the epistemological question, how do we engage with them? Do we think of ourselves as experts who are able to use these vast technologies to produce this knowledge that only we can? Or do we think about this in terms of horizontal relationships with participants and the groups that we're working with? Are we doing it covertly or overtly? There's not a necessarily right answer, right? Not saying that you should work with terrorists or extremists if they're the groups that you're trying to understand from a distance or with the people. And then finally, to what end do we engage with collective meanings? To describe, to explain, to predict, to control. These are the typical ways we talk about it from a textbook standpoint, but these 4 things are actually power-laden relationships. And when we use computational methods, we can reinforce those power relations, or we hope we're able to organize our research and our knowledge production practices more equitably. So that's my presentation for today. Looking forward to conversations with you all. Yeah, thank you.
So now we have about 15, 20 minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions online or in the room, just raise your hand or write in the text box.
Maybe a question, if you were just, because I think some of the example that you gave obviously started from the qualitative into the kind of computational. Have you done any research with that other way, like starting with the computational and then doing the qualitative?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question of what do you mean by the start?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So actually I have tended to think about the second project as starting with a quant.
Yeah.
Because it starts here. But then you could also say that the labeling was a qualitative process. So it's hard to say, I think. But we have had quite a few papers where we start with text data and we run maybe a topic model. And then so that's I guess you could think of that as the quant. And then we look at the texts which fall under those. I think that the paper that we submitted to the special issue on the spatial and temporal features of geopolitics, right? I think it was something like that. So we looked at speeches by Trump and speeches by Duterte during the pandemic, and then we tried to see what were the words that kind of distinguished the way they talked about the world. So I think our paper was about constructing the globality of the pandemic, right? So it started with that, we computed what were the words, what were the other countries they were referring to, and then we did the qual where we were looking at what are the texts which contain those highly distinctive words and place names. So it can work like that, yeah. Anything online?
So far, I had a question actually.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So in terms of just a minor thing in one of the things that I saw that I think it was just the slide before this.
Okay.
Where you do the iterator.
Yes.
Yeah. So is that sort of proportion typical for what you find when you're doing this kind of classification approach, and then when you did the validation, the training and validation proportions, it's 77%, 76%. Is that a reasonable sort of performance to expect from you?
So this was a very long time ago now. I think with the current models that are openly available, you would want much higher performance these days in terms of the modeling part, right? So the 77% was really with a much more, at the time it was new and now it's old. At the time we thought it was a very good model. 77% for what I guess on average you would do is 50-50, right? In terms of the reliability analysis, this one, we were looking at existing annotation reliability scores within the NLP field. We tended to see 0.6, 0.7. So we were thinking, okay, this is fine, right? Especially considering that we were we were working with annotators from different political positions. I think I removed it already from my presentation, so I was interested in time, but there's another study that I wasn't involved with, but Tina had led, I think back in 2016, where they also were doing something similar with annotations, but it was in the wake of this Christian-Muslim conflict in the Philippines. And we had a team with a Christian scholar and a Muslim scholar, and we were asking them, is there dehumanization in this text? And what was really amazing was the iterator reliability was so low because the Christian would keep asserting that certain statements were neutral. And the Muslim was the one who could see the dehumanization that was taking place. So we ended up building two separate classifiers, one that would reflect the perspective of the Christian, which is flattening out the dehumanization, and another one that was more like, in our view at the time, it was more critical. Like, yeah, you might not think this is dehumanizing, but for me, this is very dehumanizing. So it can happen like that, no? So here, I think if you're working with a more technical perspective, you want the reliability to be high, and an error is an anomaly from that ideal. But in that particular research project, the error was the meaning, right? And so that can also be something that is very different from how a pure computer scientist would think about it. Like, they would say this is bad data because nobody's agreeing, but the disagreement became the point. Yeah. So when you're dealing with meaning making, it can be like the insight will come from unexpected places sometimes, or what in a computing sense you would think as unconventional. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have seen some instances of computational papers that seem to be critical in a way that perhaps traditional methods and critical sort of approaches wouldn't be able to get at, because they essentially, you can't see it.
Yeah.
Unless you're using the computational route, because they tend to be emergent or have to do with like I mean, it's largely like emergent sort of properties of the network or the community structure or something like this, where, even if you're like interrogating language or like looking through like the subjectivities of people in different places, they wouldn't see it themselves because they're within that emergent structure and don't necessarily recognize it either. Can you speak a little bit about like how would you go about classifying that kind of work, or how would you sort of orient yourself towards being critical at that level?
Yeah. No, that's a very good issue to point out. I think if you're a scholar that's interested in those kinds of critical questions, at least what I hope to show here was that computational methods can help you apprehend the structure that introduces regularity to meaning making, and that's not something that you can necessarily just assert if you're just reading through a whole bunch of texts. So sometimes it takes the numbers to be able to show that, oh, that line is there, right, or that border seems to be something actually systematic. Right, but I think what you're pointing out is that there may be other features of, not necessarily like social structuring of meaning, but other features of our social world which can be of interest to critical scholars that maybe computational methods can also surface, not just framed in that particular way. Yeah, no, I think that's totally an interesting area to explore and maybe get a better vocabulary handle on. What I find so fascinating is that because there are such, to my mind, relatively few people asking these sorts of questions, it's a fairly underdeveloped, like field. I think, to think about these topics, like as a methodological thing, not just in a particular, emotions, right? So yeah, definitely. I think another thing that I've been thinking about was if it's something that is an object. So yeah, an object of political contestation. Sometimes if you're just purely qualitative, you can have a hard time claiming that your interpretation is trustworthy if you have an outgroup in your data, right? Like they're just gonna say, oh, you're just spreading propaganda, right? Because you're reading our responses in a certain way. But if you say instead, oh, in the for example, the pro-populist data, these were the most common ones. That at least is something that they will not dispute, right? Like, no, this is really like you're really emphasizing father, you're emphasizing God, these sorts of things. And then a conversation can actually proceed from there, rather than asserting, I subjectively interpreted your utterances as being very Father and God, right? And instead you say 80% said this, right? That touches on the sort of question of knowledge production as a social action feature of things. So sometimes when we're trying to talk about our research, it's like, how did you know that? You know, how did you know that? How can you really tell? And sometimes it helps us like rhetorically, it helps us in terms of like connecting with these communities, to actually have the numbers.
I guess it can help, build trust.
Yeah, that you know, I mean, like as researchers, we know that even the use of numbers, there's a sense of you're still making decisions and all of that, but at least it helps kind of lower that sense that you're trying to paint us a certain way.
The idea of like,
Yeah.
okay, here's the
Yeah.
numbers, let's talk about it.
Yes,
Not like, here's the numbers, here's what I think they mean.
right, exactly.
It's that sort of difference that really like I think is more trustworthy.
Yeah.
But what do you do when you can't, at this level here, where you're like looking for annotators, classifiers, you can't get someone to work with you from that sort of
Right.
perspective in a way that is constructive,
Yeah, like for example, if I'm studying white supremacy.
which is what I tried to do in Austria.
Yeah.
We failed.
No, I mean, and for my dissertation, I was studying hate speech, so it was like I'm not gonna look for so that we can have a. I mean, yeah, I think the question then becomes, what does it mean to have trustworthy interpretation? And this is something that qualitative researchers have really like struggled with and talked extensively about also. And one way is making sure that there's a dialogical process and all of that. But if that doesn't apply to your phenomenon, I think there are other ways to do that. I'm not an expert in all those ways. Yeah, I do actually wonder if LLMs have a role to play in situations like that, like a white supremacy situation. Yeah, I'm not sure. I cannot say I have a perfect answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions online? Okay. Thank you all for being here. The next session is tomorrow, also starting at 10 a.m. You can see the full schedule and the registration links on our website. I'll just drop that in Teams chat now in case that would be useful. And a few of you have asked if we can share slides. I will definitely ask the speakers if they would be willing to do so. And if they are, I would be happy to do that for everyone registered for these sessions. And of course, I will also remind you, if you can't make it tomorrow or missed part of today, we'll be uploading all of the recordings to YouTube eventually, and you'll have access to them on our website as well. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the day. And thank you, Josh.
Thank you.